In a climate-controlled vault beneath the ruins of what was once the Royal Library of Isfahan, there exists a manuscript that curators refuse to photograph. The pages, yellowed and cracking at their edges, contain an illustration that has disturbed every scholar who has gazed upon it for more than a few moments. The image shows figures suspended in mid-air above a vast and seemingly endless desert, their bodies draped across ornate carpets woven with patterns that seem to shift and move in peripheral vision. What troubles those who study this ancient text is not the impossibility of the scene depicted, but rather the expressions captured on the faces of those who ride these impossible vehicles. Their mouths are open in what could be screams of joy, or perhaps shrieks of absolute terror. Their eyes are wide, reflecting something the artist saw, but could not or would not fully render. The distinction matters, because if these illustrations documented something real, then we must ask ourselves a question that challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world. Were flying carpets actual technological artifacts that have been lost to the erosion of time and the destruction of knowledge? Or were they something far stranger? Something that transcends our modern understanding of both physics and reality itself. This is not a question of childhood fantasy or animated folklore. This is a mystery that has consumed archaeologists, historians, and seekers of forbidden knowledge for centuries. Some of those seekers found fragments of answers in forgotten temples buried beneath shifting sands. Others discovered references in archives that were sealed away for reasons that authorities refused to explain. And many of those who pursued this truth too eagerly simply vanished, leaving behind only cryptic final letters or journals filled with increasingly disturbed observations about what they had begun to uncover. The question that should keep us awake at night, the question that whispers through the ruins of Persepolis and echoes in the abandoned caravanserai along the Silk Road, is this: what if the carpets never stopped flying? What if they are still out there, waiting in the darkness between dunes, carrying riders to destinations that exist outside the maps we trust? Rang? In the dusty archives of Istanbul's Solomonic Library, a manuscript collector named David Morgenstern made a discovery in 1973 that would cost him his sanity. The text he found, a fragmentary copy of a 10th century Arabic treatise, contained something that medieval scholars had carefully avoided translating: precise technical specifications for King Solomon's legendary flying throne. But Morgenstern's descent into obsession began not with what he read, but with what he dreamed the night after first touching the ancient pages. He saw himself suspended above Jerusalem, the city rendered in impossible detail for an era he had never studied, watching geometric patterns of light pulse beneath a massive carpet that defied every law of physics he understood. He was not the first to experience this. He would not be the last. The legends of Solomon's flying throne appear across three major religious traditions, each preserving different fragments of what scholars have long dismissed as pure mythology. The Hebrew texts describe a throne of ivory and gold, decorated with mechanical lions and eagles that moved of their own accord. The Islamic accounts, particularly those found in the tales of the prophets, go further. They speak of a carpet 60 miles long and 60 miles wide, woven from green silk and gold thread, capable of transporting Solomon's entire court, his army, and even the birds and beasts under his command, from Damascus to Medina, in the span of a single morning meal. But it is in the technical marginalia, the notes that medieval translators left untranslated or marked as corrupt text, that the true disturbing pattern emerges. These passages don't read like folklore. They read like engineering manuals written in a code that someone desperately wanted preserved, but safely obscured. A 14th century manuscript known as the Kitab al-Bulhan, housed in Oxford's Bodleian Library, contains a section describing the throne's construction that uses terminology uncomfortably similar to modern aeronautical engineering. The text specifies 7 layers of materials, each with distinct properties. The innermost layer, according to the Arabic, consists of a substance called zahab al-ruh, literally spirit gold, described as a metal that becomes lighter when heated rather than expanding. The geometric patterns woven into the throne's surface are not decorative. The manuscript explicitly states they are qanun, laws, or formulas that must be precisely replicated or the device will not function. The Jewish mystical tradition, preserves its own technical fragments. The Zohar, compiled in 13th century Spain, contains a curious passage about Solomon's control over the Rushot, the spirits of wind. But the Hebrew word used is not the common roh. It is a much older term, one that appears in Akkadian texts from Babylon. Zibu at. Modern scholars translate this as wind or breeze, but the Akkadian root suggests something more specific, a controlled flow, a directed force. The passage describes Solomon using divine names, specific phonetic formulations, to command these zibu to lift and propel the throne. What makes this passage extraordinary is its insistence on precision. Get a single syllable wrong, the text warns, and the zibu will tear the throne apart. These are not the vague pronouncements of myth. These are warnings from an instruction manual. In 1988, Dr. Rebecca Moss, a linguist specializing in medieval Arabic manuscripts at Cambridge, began experiencing the dreams. She had been commissioned to produce a complete translation of a newly discovered Syrian text that claimed to be based on scrolls from Solomon's own library. The text described the jinn who powered the throne, but it did not describe them as spirits or demons in the traditional sense. Instead, it used the word mu'alad, generators. The jinn, according to this account, were bound into crystalline matrices embedded in the throne's structure. The text provided specific geometric configurations for these matrices, octagonal prisms with internal angles that had to conform to ratios that Moss recognized from her amateur interest in physics as corresponding to fundamental concepts. She contacted a physicist friend, who confirmed that the ratios, if she had translated them correctly, matched relationships between electromagnetic forces. This should have been impossible. The manuscript predated Maxwell's equations by 700 years. The night after making this discovery, Moss dreamed she was standing in a workshop carved into living rock. She could smell copper and sulfur. She watched hands that were not hers inscribe geometric patterns onto sheets of hammered gold, and she understood in the dream that each angle and curve was creating a pathway for forces that had no names in any human language she knew. When she woke, she could draw the patterns from memory. She could also hear a high-pitched tone that would not fade for 3 weeks. She was not alone in this experience. Over the next 18 months, Moss connected with 4 other scholars working independently on Solomon-related texts. A professor in Tehran translating a Persian version of the throne legends. A rabbinical student in Jerusalem working through Kabbalistic commentaries on the first book of Kings. A curator at the British Museum cataloging Aramaic incantation bowls that referenced Solomon's aerial journeys. An antiquarian book dealer in Cairo, who had acquired what he claimed was a Coptic translation of a much older Egyptian text about the same flying vehicle. All 5 reported the same phenomenon, vivid dreams that felt more like memories, featuring technical details none of them consciously understood. All 5 described the same workshop, the same smell of hot metal and sulfur, the same geometric patterns. All 5 developed the same persistent ringing in their ears. When they compared notes, a more disturbing pattern emerged. The details they were dreaming matched information contained in manuscripts none of them had yet read, but that other members of the group were currently studying. Moss dreamed of a specific invocation in Aramaic weeks before the Jerusalem student found it in a damaged text. The Tehran professor described a material composition that the Cairo dealer would later discover in his Coptic manuscript. It was as if the act of studying these texts was opening a channel to something, some repository of information that existed independent of the physical documents. The historical accounts provide their own unsettling consistency. The Quran itself, in Surah Saba, describes Solomon's throne traveling a month's journey in a single morning and a month's journey in a single afternoon. The text attributes this to Allah's command, but what follows is curious. It mentions that Solomon was given power over a wind that flowed by his command. The Arabic word used for flowed is tagri, the same term used for water flowing through channels or electricity through a conductor. It implies direction, control, channeling. 1 Kings in the Hebrew Bible describes Solomon's throne in elaborate detail. 6 steps, 12 lions, a rounded top. But the Targum Shini, a later Aramaic elaboration, adds elements that sound disturbingly technical. It mentions that when Solomon sat upon the throne, a mechanism was set in motion. Eagles would lower a crown onto his head, A dove would bring him the Torah, and the throne would rise into the air. The Aramaic term for mechanism is tikkuna, a word that implies a constructed system, not a miracle. Islamic traditions preserve the most detailed account of an actual flight. According to the historian Al-Tabari, writing in the 9th century, Solomon once ordered the winged demons to transport his throne from Jerusalem to a location near Yemen, a distance of approximately 1,300 miles, in the time it took to eat a meal. The text describes Solomon sitting on the throne surrounded by his court while birds formed a canopy overhead to shield them from the sun. But the detail that arrests attention is this. The text says Solomon could control the speed and altitude of the flight by speaking specific divine names. Speak one name, the throne rose higher. Speak another, it descended. A third would increase speed. A fourth would slow or stop the motion. This is not poetic metaphor. This is a control interface. The medieval European grimoires, texts of ceremonial magic that claim to transmit Solomon's knowledge, preserve fragments that may be garbled technical instructions. The Key of Solomon, the levitation, the Ars Notoria, all contain complex geometric diagrams called seals or pentacles. Magicians were instructed to inscribe these patterns on virgin parchment or metal using specific materials at specific astronomical times. Modern occultists treat these as symbolic tools for psychological transformation. But what if the medieval copyists who preserved these diagrams did not fully understand what they were copying? What if these seals were circuit diagrams, their seemingly arbitrary symbols representing components or forces for which the copyists had no conceptual framework? Dr. Wedder, Moss and her colleagues began to suspect they were not experiencing delusions, but something far stranger, that the texts themselves, or the knowledge encoded within them, possessed a mechanism for transmitting information directly into the consciousness of those who studied them deeply enough. The patterns they all drew independently were identical down to the millimeter. When Moss showed her sketches to her physicist colleague, he went pale. The configurations, he told her, described a topological structure that theoretical physics had only recently begun to explore, a way of folding space that would allow movement without traversing the distance between points. She asked if it was possible that ancient people could have discovered this. He said no. Then he said that the mathematics worked. Then he stopped returning her calls. The question that haunts this research is simple and terrifying. What if the legends of Solomon's throne are not legends at all? What if they are fragmented memories of a technology so advanced that subsequent generations could only understand it as magic? The text described jinn bound into service, spirits of fire and air forced to obey geometric constraints and phonetic commands. But what if jinn is simply the word an ancient culture used for forces we now call electromagnetic fields, plasma dynamics, or quantum states? What if the invocations are not supernatural spells, but technical terminology from a lost scientific language? The traditional account says Solomon's throne was destroyed or hidden after his death, its secrets lost. But the manuscripts suggest something different. They suggest the knowledge was deliberately fragmented and encoded, scattered across languages and traditions, preserved in forms that would seem like superstition to the uninitiated, but that would reveal their true nature to anyone who looked deeply enough. And perhaps there is a reason the knowledge was hidden this way. Perhaps there is a reason that everyone who attempts to reconstruct it begins to dream the same dreams, to hear the same sounds, to see the same ancient workshop. Perhaps the throne was not simply a vehicle. Perhaps it was a doorway, and the invocations that powered it were not commands but coordinates. Perhaps Solomon's greatest wisdom was knowing that some doors should remain closed, and that the instructions for opening them should be written in a code that would drive mad anyone who tried to solve it. The 5 researchers who shared their dreams have all stopped their work. Moss destroyed her translations. The Tehran professor resigned his position. The others scattered, refusing to discuss what they found or what they experienced. But the manuscripts remain, waiting in their libraries and private collections, their geometric patterns perfect and precise, their invocations preserved in dead languages, waiting for the next scholar who believes they are reading myths, waiting to open the same channel to transmit the same impossible knowledge, waiting to prove that some ancient secrets were buried not because they were false, but because they were true. The evening of March 15, 2007, began like countless others in the Bahrami household, tucked into a quiet residential street in the Sadghiya district of Tehran. Family gatherings were sacred rituals here, moments when 3 generations would crowd into the modest living room with its pale blue walls and worn furniture, sharing tea and conversation as the city's traffic hummed beyond the windows. But what happened that night would fracture the family's sense of reality and set in motion a chain of events that would consume a young journalist's career and possibly his life. The centerpiece of the Bahrami living room, as it had been for over a century, was an antique Kashan carpet. Passed down through 5 generations of carpet weavers, the rug measured roughly 10 feet by 14 feet, its intricate floral patterns woven in deep crimsons, sapphire blues, and gold thread that caught the lamplight. Family patriarch Hossein Bahrami, himself the last weaver in the line, would often tell visitors that his great-great-grandfather had spent 3 years completing this particular piece, working by candlelight in a workshop that no longer existed. The carpet wasn't merely decoration. It was legacy, identity, a tangible connection to ancestors whose hands had tied each of its millions of knots. On that particular evening, 14 family members had gathered for dinner. Among them were individuals whose presence would later prove crucial to the story's credibility. Dr. Reza Gorbani, a cardiovascular surgeon at Imam Khomeini Hospital, had married into the family 12 years earlier. Fatima Karimi, a mathematics teacher at one of Tehran's more prestigious girls' schools, was Hussein's eldest daughter. And perhaps most significantly, Haji Mohammad Ahmadi, a local mullah who had served the neighborhood mosque for over 2 decades, had been invited to join the family as a longtime friend. The witnesses would later struggle to identify the exact moment when things began to shift. Dr. Gorbani recalled noticing that the tea in his glass had started to ripple, concentric circles spreading outward, though no one had touched the table. Fatima mentioned feeling a sudden chill, unusual for a March evening in Tehran, where the heating system had been running steadily. Young Mariam, Hussein's granddaughter, only 11 years old, claimed she heard a low humming sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, that made her teeth ache. But it was Haji Mohammed who first saw the carpet move. He was mid-sentence, discussing upcoming renovations to the mosque, when the words died in his throat, his eyes fixed on the carpet's southern edge, where the corner had begun to lift. Not curl or flip, as a rug might, if kicked by a passing foot, but rise smoothly, deliberately, as though invisible hands were lifting it from beneath. The conversation stuttered and stopped. All eyes turned to witness what should have been impossible. The carpet rose, not in a sudden jerk or violent movement, but with an eerie steadiness that several witnesses later described as peaceful, almost ceremonial. It climbed 1 foot off the floor, then 2, then 3, hovering at eye level with those seated on the floor cushions around it. The central medallion, a complex geometric design that Hussein's ancestor had labored over for months, now hung suspended in the air, its fringes swaying gently despite the complete absence of wind or draft. The room had fallen into absolute silence except for that persistent low hum that now everyone could hear. Dr. Gorbani, trained to observe and analyze, found himself noting clinical details even as his rational mind rebelled against what he was seeing. The carpet's position was perfectly horizontal. He would later testify, not tilted or angled, but suspended as if resting on an invisible table. The temperature in the room had dropped precipitously. His breath came out in visible clouds. Frost was actually forming on the inside of the window glass, spreading in crystalline patterns that caught the lamplight. He looked at his watch. 7:43 in the evening. He made a conscious decision to track the duration of whatever this was. Fatima Karimi, whose mathematical mind sought patterns in chaos, noticed that the carpet seemed to pulse slightly, rising and falling by perhaps an inch in a rhythm that reminded her of breathing. She later told investigators that she counted these pulses, 17 of them in total, each lasting about 7 seconds. The precision of the movement haunted her. This was not random. This was not a hoax or parlor trick. The carpet, impossibly, appeared to be alive. Haji Mohammed, whose life had been devoted to matters of faith and the unseen world, found himself whispering prayers. But he later admitted to investigators that in that moment, he did not know what he was witnessing. Was this divine intervention, A blessing upon the Barami household? Or was it something else, something that his theological training had not prepared him to encounter? His hands trembled as he watched the ancestral rug hover in defiance of gravity, its colors seeming somehow more vivid in the cold air, almost luminous. For 1 minute and 53 seconds, Dr. Gorbani's watch confirmed, the carpet remained suspended. Children who had initially gasped in wonder now pressed against their parents, unsettled by the wrongness of it all. Then, as smoothly as it had risen, the carpet began to descend. It settled back onto the floor with barely a whisper, its corners aligning almost perfectly with the impressions it had left in the pile of the underlying floor covering. The humming ceased. The temperature began to climb back toward normal, though the frost on the windows took another 10 minutes to fully melt. No one spoke for a long time after. What words could possibly capture what they had witnessed? Dr. Gorbani broke the silence first, his medical training asserting itself. He began asking questions, taking informal statements, suggesting that they document everything while memories were fresh. It was Haji Muhammad who proposed they report the incident, though to whom exactly, no one was certain. But the decision was made. Whatever they had experienced, it was too significant to simply ignore or bury in family secrets. Word of the incident spread through the neighborhood within days, as such things always do. Most responses ranged from polite skepticism to outright mockery. But the story reached the ears of 29-year-old Javad Rostami, a journalist working for a small independent weekly that covered human interest stories largely ignored by the major Tehran dailies. Javad had built a modest reputation for his careful, thorough reporting on unusual phenomena. He had covered supposed miracle healings, investigated claims of haunted buildings, and written balance pieces that neither dismissed nor endorsed the supernatural claims he encountered. When Javad arrived at the Barami household 3 days after the incident, he came prepared. He brought a 35mm camera, electromagnetic field detection equipment borrowed from an engineer friend, and a detailed questionnaire he had developed for interviewing witnesses to unusual events. What distinguished Javad from many journalists covering such stories was his methodological approach. He understood that credible witnesses did not necessarily mean credible events, but he also refused to dismiss testimony simply because it challenged conventional understanding. He interviewed each witness separately, documenting their accounts, looking for inconsistencies or signs of coordination. The stories aligned remarkably well, down to specific details about the carpet's height and the duration of the event. Dr. Gorbani's medical credentials were impeccable. Fatima Karimi had no history of making unusual claims or seeking attention, and Haji Muhammad's reputation in the community was beyond reproach. These were not people prone to fabrication or mass hysteria. Javad spent hours examining the carpet itself, photographing it from every angle, running his EMF detector across its surface. The readings he obtained puzzled him. The detector, designed to measure electromagnetic fields, showed significant anomalies concentrated in the carpet's central medallion, far higher than background radiation or typical household sources could explain. He took multiple photographs of the detector's display showing these elevated readings. He also documented scorch marks on the ceiling directly above where the carpet had hovered, marks the family insisted had not been there before that evening. Over the following 2 weeks, Javad became obsessed with the case. He researched the carpet's provenance, tracking down records of its creation in the late 1800s. He interviewed historians and experts on Persian carpets, trying to determine if there was anything unique about its materials or construction. He found one detail that intrigued him. The dyes used in carpets from that era and region sometimes incorporated mineral compounds that, in theory, might interact with electromagnetic fields in unusual ways. It was a thread of explanation, however thin. But the most compelling evidence came from photographs Javad took during a follow-up visit to the Barami home. Using high-speed film and long exposure times, he captured images that showed peculiar distortions in the air around the carpet, visible as wavering patterns similar to heat shimmer, though the room was cool. When he had these photographs analyzed by a physicist at Tehran University, the expert noted that the distortions resembled those produced by intense electromagnetic fields, though the source remained unexplained. Javad's article was nearly complete by early April of that year. He had compiled witness statements, photographs, scientific measurements, and historical context. His editor at the weekly had already allocated space for a 3-part series. Then everything stopped. Javad called his editor on April 12th, requesting more time. He said he had uncovered new information, something significant that changed the nature of the story. He promised to deliver the complete piece within a week. That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with Javad Rostami. His apartment, when his worried sister finally convinced building management to open it on April 21st, showed signs of recent occupation, but also something stranger. His research materials, all the notes and photographs related to the Bahrami case, were gone. His computer had been wiped clean. But his other possessions, his other work, everything else remained undisturbed. It was a surgical extraction, someone taking only what related to the floating carpet and nothing more. Police opened a missing persons investigation, but it led nowhere. No body was found. No ransom demands were made. No withdrawals appeared on his bank accounts. Javad Rostami had simply vanished. The official conclusion, reached without much enthusiasm, was that he had left the country voluntarily, though no passport records confirmed this. His family never accepted this explanation. They knew Javad. He would not have abandoned them without word. The only clue to his final thoughts came from a discovery made months later. His sister, while going through boxes of his belongings stored at their mother's house, found a small notebook wedged behind others on a shelf. The final entry was dated April 11, 2007, the day before his last phone call. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. It read, "They are not carpets. They are maps. The geometry is not decoration, but instruction. I know now why it moved. I know what it was showing them. I know where the others are. Tomorrow, I will have proof. Tomorrow, I will have everything." That was all. No elaboration. No explanation of who they might be, or what maps he was referring to, or what the carpet was supposedly showing the Bahrami family. Just these cryptic sentences that raised far more questions than they answered. The notebook joined the growing file of mysteries surrounding both the levitating carpet and the journalist who had tried to explain it. The Bahrami family never experienced another incident with their ancestral rug. It remains on their living room floor to this day, though visitors say the family rarely walks on it anymore. Dr. Gourbani still practices medicine in Tehran. Fatima Karimi still teaches mathematics. Haji Mohammed passed away in 2013, never having publicly recanted his testimony about what he witnessed that March evening. And somewhere, perhaps, in a drawer or a vault or a file marked classified, the complete findings of Javad Rostami still exist, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finish what he started. In the shadow of the Sahand Mountains, where the ancient quarters of Tabriz sprawl across the northwest corner of Iran, there exists a community that most outsiders will never encounter. Behind unmarked doors in the Bazaar district, master carpet weavers practice their craft as their ancestors have for centuries, bound by oaths of silence that make medieval guild secrets seem pedestrian by comparison. These are not ordinary artisans producing luxury goods for wealthy collectors. According to those who have glimpsed inside their world, they are custodians of something far stranger, something that perhaps should have remained hidden. The carpets that emerge from these hidden workshops command extraordinary prices, not merely for their beauty, but for qualities that dealers struggle to articulate. Collectors speak of patterns that seem to shift in peripheral vision, of colors that appear different depending on the phase of the moon, of textures that feel impossibly smooth despite rough wool construction. But these observable oddities pale compared to what former apprentices describe when they finally break their silence, which they do rarely and always at great personal cost. Reza Mohammadi was 17 years old when his uncle, a respected master weaver, accepted him into apprenticeship in 1983. This was not a decision made lightly. The boy had been observed since childhood, tested in ways he did not understand at the time. They examined his hands in strange ways, had him sit in darkened rooms and describe what he saw, asked him questions about his dreams with an intensity that frightened his mother. When he was finally accepted, his uncle warned him that some knowledge, once gained, could never be forgotten, and that this path would set him apart from ordinary life forever. For the first 2 years, Reza learned conventional techniques. He mastered the basic knots, studied traditional patterns, developed the finger strength and speed required for professional work. but he noticed peculiarities in the workshop schedule. Certain projects began only during specific lunar phases. The masters consulted astronomical charts with the seriousness of priests studying holy texts. And there was a locked room in the back of the workshop where older members would disappear for hours, emerging with expressions he could not read. His initiation into deeper secrets came on a winter night when the moon was completely dark. His uncle led him to the forbidden room, where 3 other masters waited. The chamber had no windows, and when the door closed behind them, the darkness was absolute. They worked entirely by touch and memory, their fingers moving across the loom with mechanical precision. But this was unlike any weaving Reza had ever experienced. The wool felt different, heavier somehow, and interspersed with the normal materials were granules of something that felt like sand, but was far colder to the touch. His uncle explained in whispers that these were not ordinary minerals. For centuries, certain families in the guild had collected fragments from meteorites that fell in the mountains, grinding them into powder so fine it could be woven into thread. The belief, he said, was that these materials from beyond Earth carried properties that could be transferred to the carpets, but only if prepared correctly, only if woven in complete darkness during the new moon, only if the weaver entered a specific mental state through rhythmic breathing and repetition of phrases in a language Reza did not recognize. He described this ritual as neither quite religious nor entirely secular. The words they spoke were not prayers, exactly, but something older. His uncle called them instructions, though he would not clarify what was being instructed or who was listening. As the night progressed and his fingers worked patterns he could not see, Reza experienced sensations he struggled to articulate even decades later in testimony given to researchers. He felt as though his hands were not entirely his own, as though something was guiding the placement of each knot with microscopic precision. The temperature in the room seemed to fluctuate wildly despite no apparent source of heat or cold, and he heard sounds, soft clicking noises that did not match the rhythm of their weaving, coming from the direction of the loom itself. When dawn finally came, and they lit the lamps, the carpet section they had completed looked ordinary enough. Beautiful, certainly, with the deep reds and blues characteristic of Tabriz work, but nothing obviously supernatural. Yet, Reza noticed that none of the masters would look directly at it for more than a moment. They covered it quickly with cloth and moved it to a special storage area. His uncle's hands trembled slightly, something Reza had never seen before in a man known for his steady grip. Other apprentices who eventually broke their silence reported similar experiences. Fatima Kazemi, who trained in a different workshop in the Old City during the 1990s, described sessions where the masters would fast for 3 days before beginning certain carpets. They would weave while in states of near exhaustion, claiming this allowed them to bypass the conscious mind, to let older knowledge work through them. She witnessed completed carpets that seemed to hum with a vibration she could feel in her bones when standing near them, though no instrument could detect any measurable frequency. The patterns themselves, according to multiple testimonies, were not merely decorative. Each design came from templates that the masters guarded ferociously, hand-drawn charts that were themselves considered dangerous to view without proper preparation. Fatima once glimpsed a master's pattern book when he left it unattended for a moment. She described symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric arrangements that seemed to create depth where none should exist on a flat page. When she tried to sketch what she remembered later that night, she found herself unable to complete the drawing, her hand stopping involuntarily whenever she approached certain configurations. The guild maintained its secrecy through a combination of traditional oaths and more practical consequences. Those who spoke too freely about the inner workings often found themselves isolated from the community that had defined their entire lives. Some reported stranger repercussions. Mehdi Tabatabai, who gave testimony to a French anthropologist in 2006, described chronic nightmares that began after he detailed specific ritual phrases to outsiders. In his dreams, he stood before looms that stretched infinitely upward into darkness, weaving patterns that had no beginning or end, unable to stop his hands from working even as he desperately wanted to wait. But perhaps no testimony carries more weight than that of Dr. Thomas Whitmore, a British textile historian who spent 4 decades studying traditional weaving techniques across Central Asia and the Middle East. In 1978, through a complex series of connections and what he later described as unfortunate persistence, He managed to gain access to one of the Tabriz Guild workshops under false pretenses. He posed as a potential buyer with connections to European museums, his knowledge of Persian textiles convincing enough to get him through the door. What Whitmore witnessed during his 3 weeks of carefully negotiated visits shook his understanding of material science. In interviews given to colleagues before his death in 2012, he spoke carefully about most aspects of his time in Tabriz. He confirmed the use of meteorite materials, noting that spectrographic analysis of samples he managed to obtain showed unusual isotope ratios consistent with extraterrestrial origin. He documented the lunar timing of certain projects and collected detailed notes on the prayer-like phrases the masters repeated during their work. But there was one demonstration, performed on his final visit, that he would only discuss in the vaguest terms even 40 years later. The masters, perhaps suspicious of his true intentions or testing him in some way, invited him to observe a completion ceremony for a carpet that had been in production for 18 months. They led him into a room with no electric lighting, only oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the walls. The carpet hung vertically on a frame, a magnificent piece measuring roughly 4 meters by 3 meters, dominated by a central medallion pattern in deep indigo and crimson. The masters formed a circle around it and began their chanting, the same phrases Whitmore had heard during weaving sessions, but now in unison, building to a rhythmic intensity. He reported that the air in the room grew thick, harder to breathe, though there was no visible smoke or fumes. The temperature dropped precipitously. And then, according to his testimony, the carpet moved. Not swayed by drafts or vibration. Moved. The patterns within it seemed to flow like liquid while the physical material remained solid. The central medallion rotated slowly despite being woven thread, impossible as that should have been. Whitmore, a man trained in empirical observation, approached closer despite his fear. He reached out to touch the carpet and later told a colleague that it felt warm, pulsing like living tissue, the wool fibers seeming to shift beneath his fingertips in ways that violated everything he understood about textile mechanics. The ceremony lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though Whitmore admitted his sense of time became unreliable. When the masters finally stopped their chanting, the carpet hung motionless again, appearing completely ordinary. They cut it down from the frame and began the process of final trimming and binding, chatting casually among themselves as if nothing unusual had occurred. But Whitmore noticed that none of them would meet his eyes, and the youngest master in the room had tears streaming down his face for no apparent reason. Whitmore managed to purchase a small antique carpet from the workshop's inventory. Not one of the ritual pieces, but an older work, he was told, contained some of the traditional methods. He had it shipped to London through standard commercial channels. It arrived at his university laboratory 3 weeks later, and he began a thorough analysis using every tool available to textile science in the late 1970s. The results were bizarre enough that he consulted colleagues in materials engineering and physics. The carpet's thread showed cellular structures that should not exist in processed wool. Under electron microscopy, certain fibers displayed what appeared to be crystalline formations integrated into the organic material at a molecular level. When samples were subjected to various light wavelengths, they exhibited reflective properties that varied in ways that seemed to anticipate the testing conditions, as if the material was somehow responsive or adaptive. One colleague suggested the readings were equipment malfunction, but when they tested the same samples across 3 different laboratories, the anomalies persisted. Most disturbing was what happened during attempted carbon dating of the dyes. The organic compounds used for coloring showed age ranges that were impossible, with some samples dating to periods far older than others in the same carpet, despite clear evidence that the entire piece had been woven in a single continuous process. It was as if different sections of the carpet existed in different time frames, though that made no rational sense. Then the carpet disappeared. Whitmore kept it in a locked storage facility at his university, accessible only to authorized researchers. He checked on it regularly, maintaining detailed logs. But one morning, in 1980, he arrived to find the storage cabinet empty, the lock undamaged, no signs of forced entry. Security cameras showed no one entering the room during the night. The carpet had simply ceased to be there. University police investigated, found nothing, and eventually the matter was quietly dropped. Whitmore continued his career, publishing respected works on Persian textile traditions. but he never wrote about his Tabriz experience in any formal academic context. Close colleagues knew he had seen something that profoundly disturbed him, but he deflected direct questions with practiced ease. In his final years, suffering from the cancer that would eventually kill him, he became slightly more forthcoming, speaking in private conversations about the limits of Western empirical frameworks, about phenomena that perhaps required different modes of understanding. But there were aspects he refused to discuss entirely. When asked what the masters told him about the purpose of their work, he would go silent. When pressed about what he thought the carpets were actually meant to do, he would change the subject. Once, after several glasses of whiskey, a former student asked him directly what he believed he had witnessed in that ceremony room. Whitmore stared at his hands for a long moment before responding that some doors, once opened, should not be walked through, and some questions lead to places the human mind is not equipped to navigate. The Tabriz guilds continue their work today, more secretive than ever in an age of digital surveillance and social media exposure. The few apprentices who have broken their silence in recent years report that the rituals have not changed, that the meteorite materials are still collected and ground, that certain carpets are still woven in darkness under specific lunar conditions. They speak of a knowledge preserved across generations, of techniques that may be far older than the Islamic period of Persian history, possibly dating back to pre-Zoroastrian traditions, now lost to conventional historical record. What truly happens in those windowless rooms, what properties those carpets actually possess, remains known only to the masters who have sworn their lives to silence. And perhaps that is for the best. Whitmore died without revealing his deepest secrets, taking to his grave whatever final understanding he had reached about what he witnessed. The carpet he tried to study exists somewhere beyond the reach of institutional cataloging, if it exists at all. And in Tabriz, behind unmarked doors, the looms continue their work, weaving patterns that may be far more than decorative, serving purposes we can only glimpse through fragments of testimony from those brave or foolish enough to speak. In the winter of 1973, a peculiar requisition order circulated through the upper echelons of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. It called for the immediate formation of a specialized military unit, one whose purpose would remain classified for over 4 decades. The official designation was Directorate 12, Department of Cultural Artifacts Recovery. The unofficial name, whispered only in the most secure corridors of power, was Operation Threshold. The genesis of this operation lay in a dusty report filed by a low-level cultural attaché stationed in Samarkand. Among routine assessments of regional museums and historical collections, he had included an odd footnote about local folklore surrounding certain antique carpets. The legends were ancient, predating Islam, reaching back to the Zoroastrian period and beyond. These stories spoke of woven textiles that could transport their owners across impossible distances, rise into the air at their master's command, and serve as gateways to realms beyond human comprehension. Most intriguing to the attaché was the insistence among local elders that these were not mere fairy tales, but degraded memories of actual artifacts that had been carefully hidden from successive waves of conquerors. Under normal circumstances, such a report would have been filed away and forgotten. But it landed on the desk of Colonel Dmitry Orekov, a man whose career in military intelligence had made him receptive to possibilities that others dismissed as superstition. Orekov had spent time in the Far East, where he had witnessed phenomena that defied conventional explanation. He had read the suppressed accounts from the Great Patriotic War, incidents of strange occurrences that had been quietly cataloged and locked away. When he read about the flying carpets of Central Asia, something resonated. He began pulling files, cross-referencing historical records with military intelligence reports from the region. What Orekov discovered was a pattern. Throughout the centuries of Russian expansion into Central Asia, there were recurring mentions in official documents of unusual textiles that required special handling or containment. A Tsarist officer's journal from 1867 mentioned a carpet seized from a Bukharan merchant that caused 3 soldiers to fall into a coma-like state when they attempted to roll it up. A Soviet administrator's report from 1929 noted the confiscation of a prayer rug from a Sufi shrine, after which the local NKVD detachment reported experiencing shared hallucinations. The artifacts themselves had been lost to bureaucratic chaos, revolutions, and wars. But the paper trails suggested something genuinely anomalous. Orekov brought his findings to his superiors. In the climate of the Cold War, with both superpowers exploring every possible avenue for strategic advantage, the proposal to investigate these accounts received approval. If there was even a remote possibility that these legends pointed towards some form of unknown technology or natural phenomenon, it was worth investigating. The potential military applications were obvious. Transportation that required no fuel, vehicles that left no heat signature, methods of movement that could bypass conventional defenses entirely. The man chosen to lead the scientific component of Operation Threshold was Dr. Yevgeny Volkov, a physicist with an unusual background. Trained at Moscow State University, Volkov had published respected papers on electromagnetic field theory before being quietly recruited into a classified research program investigating reported psychic phenomena. Unlike many of his colleagues, who treated such assignments with barely concealed cynicism, Volkov approached the work with genuine scientific curiosity. He had concluded that while most paranormal claims were either fraud or misunderstanding, there existed a small percentage of cases that suggested phenomena not yet understood by conventional physics. He believed that these anomalies, if they could be properly studied and quantified, might open new avenues of scientific understanding. The operation began in earnest in the spring of 1974. Teams of soldiers disguised as cultural ministry officials fanned out across Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. Their mission was to locate and acquire antique carpets that matched specific criteria outlined in Volkov's research protocols. The carpets had to be of significant age, predating the Islamic period if possible. They needed to show certain design elements, particular geometric patterns that appeared again and again in the legends. And most importantly, they had to be associated with local stories of unusual properties or effects. The acquisition teams operated with broad authority. They could offer compensation to private collectors, negotiate with museum directors, or simply confiscate items deemed essential to national security. Over the course of 18 months, they accumulated nearly 200 carpets, which were transported to a remote facility in the Kyzylkum Desert. The location had been chosen for its isolation and for the presence of existing military infrastructure that could be repurposed. A former weapons testing site, it offered security, space, and most importantly, distance from population centers if something went wrong. The vast majority of the collected carpets proved to be exactly what they appeared: beautiful, historically significant textiles with no anomalous properties whatsoever. Volkov's team subjected each one to a battery of tests. They measured electromagnetic emissions, checked for radioactive signatures, analyzed the chemical composition of dyes and fibers, and documented their physical properties under various environmental conditions. Most yielded nothing unusual, but 3 carpets, acquired from widely separated locations, began to exhibit behaviors that defied easy explanation. The first was a dark blue carpet, its surface covered in silver geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed indirectly. It had been taken from a private collection in Khiva, where the owner's family claimed it had been in their possession for at least 300 years. Under normal conditions, the carpet appeared inert, but when subjected to specific electromagnetic frequencies in the range between 7 and 13 Hz, instruments detected a response. The carpet began generating its own field, a weak but measurable effect that seemed to propagate outward in waves. More disturbing was the effect on personnel. Researchers, who spent extended periods in close proximity to the activated carpet, reported vivid dreams of flying over landscapes they had never seen. Ancient cities with impossible architecture, skies filled with geometries that hurt to remember upon waking. The second carpet was smaller, a prayer rug of deep crimson interwoven with gold thread. It had been removed from a Sufi shrine near Bukhara, over the strenuous objections of local religious leaders. This carpet exhibited no electromagnetic anomalies, but its effects on gravity were undeniable. When placed on a sensitive scale and subjected to certain acoustic frequencies, specifically human chanting in modal scales traditional to the region, the carpet's measured weight would fluctuate by as much as 15%. Sometimes it grew heavier, sometimes lighter. The effect was reproducible, but not consistent. The same conditions would yield different results, as if the carpet was responding to variables the researchers could not identify or control. The third carpet was the largest and the oldest. A magnificent piece dating back at least to the 10th century, perhaps earlier. It had been discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a ruined mosque in the mountains of Tajikistan. Its patterns were unlike anything in the standard typology of Central Asian textile art. The design seemed to incorporate elements from multiple traditions, Persian and Chinese and something else, something that the experts could not place. This carpet remained completely inert through every standard test. It was not until a researcher working late one night fell asleep beside it that its properties manifested. The young scientist woke, or believed he woke, to find the carpet's surface had become translucent. Looking down through its weave, he saw not the concrete floor of the laboratory, but a vista of stars, a void of impossible depth. He described feeling a pull, a terrible invitation to step forward onto that surface and fall through into whatever lay beyond. He scrambled backward, his screams bringing guards running. By the time they arrived, the carpet had returned to normal. But the researcher was never quite the same. He resigned from the project within a week, and 6 months later he took his own life, leaving a note that consisted only of the repeated phrase, "I saw where it leads." Dr. Volkov became increasingly consumed by the research. Colleagues noted changes in his behavior, his appearance. He slept in his office, ate irregularly, and spent hours alone with the carpets, particularly the third one, the ancient piece from the mountains. He filled notebooks with observations, theories, and increasingly, with what appeared to be warnings to himself. Do not listen when it hums. The patterns are not decorative, they are instructional. It responds to intention, not action. In his reports to Colonel Orakov and the Oversight Committee, Volkov maintained scientific objectivity. He documented effects, proposed hypotheses, and recommended additional research protocols. But in his private notes, a different picture emerged. He had become convinced that the carpets were not human creations, or at least, not entirely. The technology, if it could be called that, predated any known civilization in the region. The carpets were not primitive aircraft or examples of lost scientific knowledge. They were something else entirely. Interfaces, perhaps. Bridges between states of reality. And most crucially, they were not meant to be used lightly, or by those who did not understand their true nature. The final experiment took place on a cold November night in 1976. Volkov had requested permission to attempt a controlled activation of all three anomalous carpets simultaneously. He theorized that the individual effects might compound or clarify if the objects were brought into proximity. The Oversight Committee approved the test, perhaps unwisely. They trusted Volkov's scientific judgment, and the potential payoff, if he could unlock the mechanism behind these phenomena, was too valuable to pass up. What happened in that desert facility is pieced together from multiple sources. The official incident report, heavily redacted even in its declassified form. The testimony of security personnel stationed outside the testing chamber. The fragmented recordings from surveillance cameras that malfunctioned halfway through the experiment. And most hauntingly, Volkov's own final report, a document that reads less like a scientific paper and more like a confession. The three carpets were arranged in a triangular formation in the center of the chamber. Volkov entered alone, carrying equipment to generate the electromagnetic frequencies and acoustic tones that had previously triggered responses. Security footage shows him moving between the carpets, making adjustments, taking readings. Then he sits down, cross-legged at the center of the triangle. For several minutes, nothing appears to happen. Then the lights in the chamber begin to flicker. The cameras experience interference, the image breaking up into static. The guards outside reported hearing sounds they struggled to describe. Not quite humming, not quite chanting, but something that seemed to resonate in their bones rather than their ears. One guard later said it sounded like enormous wings, beating in a space too vast to imagine. The temperature in the corridor dropped precipitously. Frost formed on the metal door of the testing chamber. And then, for approximately 47 seconds, all electrical power in the facility failed completely. Backup generators kicked in, and when the lights returned, the door to the testing chamber was open. Volkov was found collapsed just outside the chamber. Unconscious, but alive. The three carpets remained inside, arranged exactly as before, showing no signs of damage or disturbance. But something had changed. Personnel entering the chamber reported an overwhelming sense of wrongness. a feeling that the space itself had been altered in some fundamental way. Several experienced severe nausea. One soldier refused to enter, claiming he could see figures standing in the corners of the room, though the cameras showed nothing. Volkov remained in a coma-like state for 3 days. When he finally regained consciousness, he was lucid but profoundly shaken. He refused to discuss the details of what had occurred during those missing 47 seconds. Instead, he immediately wrote his final report, working feverishly for 6 hours straight, then hand-delivering it to Colonel Orakov. The report was brief, barely 3 pages. Most of it consisted of technical recommendations for securing and containing the 3 carpets. But the conclusion was stark and unambiguous. He wrote that the carpets were not vehicles in any sense that military planners would understand. They did not transport the physical body from one location to another. Instead, they altered the relationship between the user and space itself, folding dimensions, creating apertures into adjacencies that existed alongside normal reality. They were thresholds, doorways, and what lay on the other side was aware. It noticed when the doors were open. It was curious about what existed in our world. And worse, it was patient. It could wait. It had been waiting, perhaps, for centuries, for someone to finally open the way wide enough for it to respond. Volkov's final recommendation was unequivocal. Terminate all research immediately. Seal the carpets in lead-lined containers. Bury them separately, in locations that should never be recorded or revealed. Under no circumstances should they ever be activated again, individually or together. He concluded with the warning that would later become infamous among those few cleared to know about Operation Threshold. They are not vehicles, they are thresholds. And we have been knocking, loudly, on a door that should have remained closed. The project was shut down within a week. The facility in the Kazilkum Desert was decommissioned and later demolished. The 3 anomalous carpets disappeared into the classified storage system, their locations known only to a handful of individuals. The other collected carpets were quietly returned to museums or sold at auction, their brief role in a secret research program erased from official records. Dr. Yevgeny Volkov was debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and reassigned to conventional research. He never published another paper. He never spoke about Operation Threshold, not even to his family. In 1981, Volkov died in what was officially ruled a heart attack. He was 43 years old, previously in good health. He was found in his apartment, seated at his desk, pen still in hand. Before him lay a sheet of paper covered in geometric patterns, designs that bore an unsettling resemblance to the weaving on the 3rd carpet, the ancient one from the mountains. In the margin he had written a single phrase, over and over, filling every available space. It remembers me. It remembers me. It remembers me. The documents that reveal this story were declassified gradually, beginning in the late 1990s and continuing through the 2000s. Most remain heavily redacted. Key details about the facility location, the current whereabouts of the anomalous carpets, and the full contents of Volkov's final report are still classified at the highest levels. But enough has emerged to confirm the basic facts. Operation Threshold existed. It investigated claims of anomalous properties in antique Central Asian carpets, and it was shut down abruptly after an incident that terrified its lead scientist badly enough to end his career. The question that haunts researchers today, those few who know about these events and dare to discuss them, is deceptively simple. What did Volkov see in those 47 seconds when the power failed? What opened when he activated all 3 thresholds simultaneously? And most troubling of all, if the carpets are still in storage somewhere, sealed and contained, is the door truly closed or merely unattended? In the spring of 2003, Marcus Ashworth stood in a dimly lit auction house in Damascus, his heart racing as he examined what would become both his greatest acquisition and his final obsession. The carpet before him measured roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, its surface depicting an intricate lattice of geometric patterns in deep blues, crimsons, and golds that seemed to shift in the flickering light. The estate sale had attracted little attention from other dealers, but Ashworth, a respected British antiquities trader with over 20 years of experience, recognized something extraordinary in the weave. The carpet allegedly came from a private collection that had remained sealed since the 1920s, part of an estate belonging to a Syrian merchant family whose lineage traced back to the Ottoman period. According to the sparse documentation provided, the piece had been purchased in Jerusalem in 1897 from a dealer who claimed it originated from much older sources. The provenance was sketchy at best, but Ashworth had built his reputation on trusting his instincts, and every fiber of his being told him this was genuine. What caught his attention were not just the exceptional preservation and the quality of the knotting, which numbered over 500 per square inch, but the peculiar symbols woven into the border. They resembled no conventional Islamic calligraphy or decorative motifs he had encountered in his extensive career. Instead, they appeared to be a hybrid of Hebrew characters and something far older, possibly Aramaic or even pre-Babylonian cuneiform. In the center medallion, barely visible unless the light struck at precisely the right angle, was a six-pointed star surrounding what appeared to be a throne. Ashworth purchased the carpet for £12,000, a substantial sum, but one he considered a bargain for what he believed might be a genuine artifact connected to the legendary flying carpets of Solomon. According to biblical and Quranic tradition, King Solomon possessed a carpet woven of green silk that could transport him and his entire court through the air, carried by the wind at his command. Most scholars dismissed such tales as pure mythology, but Ashworth had always maintained a healthy respect for the kernel of truth that often lay hidden within ancient legends. Upon returning to his London flat in Mayfair, he installed the carpet in his private study, a wood-paneled room lined with rare manuscripts and artifacts. He began what his assistant, 26-year-old Rebecca Chen, would later describe as an all-consuming research project. Ashworth photographed every inch of the carpet, creating detailed digital maps of the symbols and patterns. He consulted with linguists at Oxford and Cambridge, sending them images of the border inscriptions. He spent hours in the British Library, poring over medieval grimoires and texts on Jewish mysticism. Rebecca noticed the changes in her employer within the first month. Ashworth had always been meticulous and focused, but now he seemed possessed by a singular purpose. He stopped taking calls from other clients. He canceled appointments with buyers who had been courting him for years regarding other pieces in his collection. His sleep schedule became erratic. Rebecca would arrive at the office in the morning to find him already there, surrounded by open books and notebooks filled with sketches, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. The notebooks themselves became increasingly disturbing. At first, they contained careful scholarly annotations and comparative linguistic analyses. But as weeks turned into months, the pages grew chaotic. Ashworth began filling them with obsessive reproductions of the carpet's symbols, drawn over and over again in different sizes and configurations. Some pages featured a single character, repeated hundreds of times until the ink bled through multiple sheets. Other pages showed elaborate diagrams that resembled architectural plans or perhaps maps of something Rebecca could not identify. By late summer, Ashworth's behavior had progressed beyond mere obsession into territory that genuinely frightened his assistant. He began speaking to himself in what sounded like nonsense syllables, though Rebecca suspected he might be attempting to pronounce the ancient characters he had been studying. He would stand before the carpet for hours, not moving, barely blinking, his lips moving in silent recitation. When she asked if he was feeling well, he would turn to her with a strange intensity in his eyes and insist he was on the verge of understanding something profound. In September of 2003, Rebecca arrived at the office to find the door to Ashworth's private study locked from the inside. This was unusual but not unprecedented when he was examining particularly valuable pieces. She went about her morning tasks, cataloging recent acquisitions and responding to correspondence. By midday, when Ashworth still had not emerged, she began to worry. She knocked repeatedly, calling his name, but received no response. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the afternoon when she heard a sound from within the study that made her blood run cold. It was a low humming, almost musical, but with an underlying vibration that she felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. The sound rose and fell in rhythmic waves, accompanied by what seemed like whispered voices speaking in unison, though she could not make out any words. Rebecca used her emergency key to unlock the door. What she saw in that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Marcus Ashworth was suspended approximately 3 feet above his bed, which he kept in the study for late nights. He appeared to be asleep, his body horizontal and perfectly still, his arms at his sides. Beneath him, the Solomon carpet rippled and undulated as though it were liquid rather than woven fabric. The surface moved in waves that did not follow any natural pattern of air currents or physical disturbance. The colors seemed more vivid than she remembered, almost luminescent, and the symbols in the border appeared to pulse with a faint golden light. Rebecca stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what she was witnessing. The humming sound seemed to emanate from the carpet itself, filling the room with a resonance that made her teeth ache. She tried to call out to Ashworth, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. As she watched, his body rotated slowly in the air, turning to face the ceiling, and she could see that his eyes were moving rapidly beneath closed lids, as though he were deep in dream. The moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though Rebecca later testified it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as if someone had flipped a switch, Ashworth dropped. He fell to 3 feet to the bed with a heavy thump that knocked the wind out of him and startled him awake. The carpet went still, its surface once again appearing as nothing more than woven fabric. The humming ceased, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Ashworth sat up, disoriented and gasping. When he saw Rebecca in the doorway, her face pale with shock, he seemed confused by her distress. He insisted he had simply been resting, and must have had a vivid dream. When she tried to explain what she had witnessed, he dismissed her concerns with increasing agitation. He claimed she must have been mistaken, that tricks of light and exhaustion had created an illusion. But Rebecca noticed his hands were shaking, and when he stood, he had to grip the bedpost to steady himself. That evening, Rebecca filed a detailed report of the incident with her personal diary, including sketches of what she had witnessed. She also reached out to 2 of Ashworth's longtime friends in the antiquities trade, expressing her concern for his mental and physical well-being. Both promised to check in on him, but within days, such interventions would become impossible. On the night of September 23, 2003, Marcus Ashworth locked himself in his study once again. This time, he would not emerge. The following morning, when Rebecca arrived to find the door locked and no response to her knocking, she immediately contacted the police. Officers arrived by 10 o'clock and after repeated attempts to gain entry, forced the door open. The scene they discovered defied logical explanation. The study was in disarray, with books scattered across the floor and furniture overturned, as though there had been a violent struggle. Ashworth's notebooks lay open, their final pages covered in frantic symbols, drawn so forcefully that the pen had torn through the paper. But Marcus Ashworth himself was nowhere to be found. The windows were all locked from the inside. The door had been secured with both the primary lock and an interior bolt that could only be engaged from within the room. The police report noted only one possible exit, a skylight in the ceiling, approximately 18 inches square, designed for ventilation rather than access. The skylight was found open, but even the smallest officer on the scene could not fit through the opening. For a grown man of Ashworth's build, 6 feet tall and weighing over 14 stone, passage through that space would have been physically impossible. The Solomon carpet lay in the center of the room, but it had been utterly destroyed. The fabric was shredded into thousands of strips, as though something with immense power had torn it apart from the inside. The damage was not consistent with cutting, or burning, or any conventional form of destruction. Instead, the fibers appeared to have been pulled apart along impossible angles, frayed and separated at the molecular level. The investigation team included a textile expert who stated on record that she had never seen damage of this nature, and could not explain how it had been achieved. Blood was found on some of the carpet fragments, typo positive, matching Ashworth's medical records. But the quantity was minimal, only a few drops, insufficient to indicate serious injury. More disturbing were the scorch marks found on the ceiling around the skylight, radiating outward in a pattern that suggested intense heat applied from below, as though something had burned its way upward through the roof. The police investigation continued for 6 months. Marcus Ashworth was listed as a missing person, his photograph distributed to airports, train stations, and border crossings throughout Europe and the Middle East. His financial records showed no unusual transactions after his disappearance. His passport was found in his desk drawer. Despite extensive inquiries and even consultation with Scotland Yard's specialized units, no trace of him was ever found. Rebecca Chen, provided testimony about the levitation incident she had witnessed, though she was keenly aware of how unbelievable it sounded. Several officers privately expressed skepticism, suggesting she had been deceived by some trick Ashworth had staged. But the lead investigator, Detective Chief Inspector Martin Holloway, took her account seriously, particularly in light of the physical impossibilities surrounding Ashworth's disappearance. In the years since 2023, disturbing patterns have emerged. At least 7 carpets bearing similar characteristics to Ashworth's piece have surfaced on the international black market for antiquities. Each features the same hybrid symbolism, the same impossibly tight weave, the same peculiar shifting quality in its colors, and each has been followed by a trail of misfortune. In 26, a private collector in Paris purchased one such carpet for 30,000 euros. Within 3 months, he was hospitalized with severe insomnia and hallucinations. He claimed the carpet whispered to him at night, teaching him words in a language that predated human speech. He was found dead in his apartment 6 weeks after his hospitalization, his body positioned in the center of the carpet, which showed signs of the same impossible shredding that had destroyed Ashworth's piece. A gallery owner in Istanbul acquired another specimen in 2009. She reported vivid dreams of flying over ancient cities, of seeing the world from impossible heights. Her business partner discovered her standing on the roof of their 4-story building one night, barefoot and apparently sleepwalking, moments from stepping off the edge. The carpet was immediately sold to an anonymous buyer. Its current whereabouts are unknown. Most recently in 2021, a wealthy tech entrepreneur in California purchased what he believed was an authentic Solomon carpet from a private dealer in Dubai. He documented his acquisition extensively on social media, posting photographs and videos of the piece. In one video, viewed over 2 million times before it was deleted, the carpet can be clearly seen moving, its surface rippling in a room with no air current, while the collector sleeps peacefully in a chair beside it. That collector, whose name has been withheld by his family's request, disappeared under circumstances nearly identical to Marcus Ashworth's case. His penthouse apartment was found locked from the inside, the only possible exit a ventilation shaft far too small for human passage. The carpet was gone entirely, leaving behind only scorch marks on the floor in the precise shape of its dimensions. Scholars of Middle Eastern antiquities have begun quietly discussing these incidents at conferences, always off the record, always with the caveat that they are merely sharing curiosities rather than endorsing supernatural explanations. Yet the pattern is undeniable. The carpets exist. People acquire them. Strange phenomena occur, and then the collectors vanish, leaving behind only destruction and unanswerable questions. Rebecca Chen, now a successful antiquities consultant in her own right, refuses to handle any carpets in her professional practice. When asked about Marcus Ashworth, she speaks carefully, measuring her words. She describes him as a brilliant man who stumbled upon something that humanity was perhaps never meant to rediscover. And late at night, she still sometimes dreams of that September afternoon, when she watched her employer floating in defiance of gravity, suspended above a carpet that moved like living water, and wonders if somewhere, in some dimension beyond our understanding, Marcus Ashworth is still flying. The surveillance footage from MIT's Applied Quantum Research Laboratory, dated March 14, 2022, shows Dr. Layla Hassan entering her workspace at 3:17 in the morning. She's carrying what appears to be a rolled carpet under one arm, her security badge dangling from her lab coat pocket. What the timestamp doesn't show, what it can't capture, is that in less than 6 hours, that laboratory would be nothing more than scorched metal and melted equipment, and Dr. Hassan would vanish from the academic world entirely. Layla Hassan wasn't supposed to become the center of one of the most disturbing scientific controversies of the 21st century. Her credentials were impeccable. Double doctorate from Cambridge in theoretical physics and materials science, 14 years at MIT, over 60 peer-reviewed papers on quantum field theory. She was, by every measure, the embodiment of rigorous scientific methodology, which makes what happened next so profoundly unsettling. Her descent into what colleagues would later call obsession began innocuously enough in the fall of 2020. Hassan was attending a university fundraiser at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts when she wandered into the textile wing. There, Behind protective glass hung a 16th century Persian carpet from the Safavid dynasty. The placard mentioned its unusual preservation, how the colors remained vibrant despite 500 years of existence, how scholars noted peculiar electromagnetic readings in its vicinity that required special display cases. Hassan stood before that carpet for 47 minutes. Security footage confirmed this. Other guests moved through the gallery, but she remained motionless, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. What she saw in those patterns, in those specific geometric configurations, would consume the next 18 months of her life. She began requesting access to museum archives across 3 continents. Her research grant applications took an unusual turn. Instead of the quantum computing project she was known for, she started submitting proposals about historical textiles and what she termed inadvertent quantum field architecture. Nino why? The initial mockery from her department was gentle. MIT professors are accustomed to eccentric colleagues. But Hassan's mathematical models were disturbingly rigorous. She presented equations demonstrating how certain weaving patterns, when created with specific material ratios, metallic thread counts, and dimensional proportions, could theoretically create standing wave formations in quantum fields. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually, measurably interact with zero-point energy fluctuations. Her papers, 3 of which were published before academic journals began rejecting her work, detailed something that seemed impossible. Ancient weavers in Persia, Anatolia, and parts of Central Asia had, according to her calculations, stumbled upon geometric configurations that modern quantum physics was only beginning to understand. The specific angular relationships in their patterns, the precise ratios of wool to silk to metallic thread, the knotting density and tension specifications, all of these created what Hassan called unintentional quantum resonance devices. She wasn't claiming ancient mysticism or lost civilizations. Her argument was more unnerving. She proposed that human beings, through trial and error across generations, had discovered these patterns produce tangible effects. Carpets that seemed to make rooms feel different. Textiles that affected mood and perception in ways attributed to aesthetics, but were actually measurable field interactions. Knowledge preserved not through scientific understanding, but through tradition and craft, passed down as sacred geometry without anyone knowing why these specific patterns mattered. The mathematics were sound enough that 3 independent physicists verified her equations before backing away from the implications. Dr. Marcus Webb, from Stanford, wrote in a private email later, leaked to the press, "The calculations work. I've checked them 5 times. But what she's suggesting violates everything we understand about intentionality in quantum systems. This can't be right, even though I can't find the error." Now Hassan's recreation attempts began in January of 2022. She'd obtained historical specifications from 4 different carpet designs, all from the same 100-year period in 16th century Persia, all from workshops in the city of Kashan. Using traditional materials, she commissioned weavers to recreate these pieces following exact historical measurements. Natural dyes derived from period-appropriate sources, hand-spun wool at specific fiber lengths, silver and gold thread at precise weight ratios. The dimensions matched to within millimeters of the originals. The first carpet arrived at her laboratory on February 3rd. It measured approximately 3 meters by 2 meters. Its pattern a complex geometric arrangement of interlocking stars and hexagons. According to her lab notes, Hassan placed it in a shielded testing chamber and began taking baseline measurements. Electromagnetic field readings, thermal imaging, quantum vacuum fluctuation detectors of her own design. For the first 72 hours, nothing unusual appeared in the data. Then at 9:37 p.m. on February 6th, her instruments recorded what she described in her notes as a discrete thermal anomaly with no corresponding energy input source. The carpet's surface temperature had dropped by exactly 3.4 degrees Celsius in a perfect geometric pattern matching certain elements of the weave design. The surrounding air temperature remained constant. She expanded her sensor array. Over the following week, the anomalies intensified. Electromagnetic fluctuations appeared in pulses, always aligned with specific pattern elements in the carpet. Her quantum vacuum detectors, instruments designed to measure zero-point energy field variations, showed readings that shouldn't have been possible. The carpet appeared to be extracting minute amounts of energy from quantum vacuum fluctuations and redistributing it according to its geometric pattern structure. Hassan's lab notes from this period grow increasingly detailed and increasingly unsettled. On February 14th, she writes, "Stood in the testing chamber for 20 minutes today. The sensation near the carpet is difficult to articulate. Not temperature, not air pressure. Something else. A feeling of space being subtly wrong. Angles not quite aligning with visual perception. Had to leave. Felt nauseous for an hour afterward." She commissioned 3 more carpets. Each arrived with slightly different pattern variations from the same historical period and region. By early March, she had all 4 installed in separate testing chambers, each surrounded by instruments that ran continuously, feeding data to her monitoring systems. The laboratory security footage from this period shows Hassan spending longer and longer hours in the facility, arriving before dawn, leaving well after midnight. Her colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, later testified that Hassan had become withdrawn, declining lunch invitations, skipping department meetings. When Chen visited the laboratory unannounced on March 8, she reported that Hassan seemed startled, almost frightened by the interruption. She had all these monitors showing wave patterns and field readings, Chen told investigators. "I asked what she was measuring and she just said resonance effects. But the look on her face, I'd never seen Layla look like that. She seemed scared of her own data." The data itself was profoundly strange. Hassan's instruments showed that the 4 carpets, isolated in separate chambers, were exhibiting synchronized fluctuation patterns. When one showed a thermal anomaly, the others responded within milliseconds, despite being shielded from all known forms of electromagnetic communication. The pattern suggested quantum entanglement, but between macroscopic objects at room temperature. Impossible by every established theory. On March 11th, Hassan activated all 4 testing chambers simultaneously while running her full sensor suite. Her notes from that experiment are fragmented, almost incoherent. Synchronization at 87%. Field coherence exceeding theoretical models. Visual distortions observed directly, not just instrumental. Geometry of chamber space appearing to shift near carpet surfaces. Discontinued experiment at 14 minutes. Severe disorientation. Need to recalibrate or need to accept that calibration is correct and implications are. The sentence ends there. Her final video log was recorded at 11:43 p.m. on March 13th, less than 6 hours before the fire. The footage was recovered from a backup server that Hassan had configured to automatically upload recordings to an off-site encrypted storage system. In the video, she sits at her workstation, the laboratory darkened except for the glow from multiple monitors behind her. She looks exhausted. Her eyes are red-rimmed, her hair pulled back carelessly. When she speaks, her voice is steady, but there's an undercurrent of something that sounds like fear or awe or both. "This will be my last attempt at formal documentation," she says to the camera. "I've submitted my findings to 4 journals, all rejected. I've sent the data to colleagues. Most won't respond. The ones who do suggest stress leave or psychiatric evaluation. But the measurements don't lie. The patterns are real." She glances at something off camera, then back to the lens. "Tomorrow morning I'm running a full resonance test with all 4 specimens simultaneously. I've calculated that if the synchronization effects scale geometrically rather than linearly, we should see definitive proof of zero-point energy interaction. Measurable, undeniable proof." Her hands are trembling slightly as she adjusts something on her desk. "I know how this sounds. I know what I'm risking professionally. But if I'm right, if these patterns actually work the way the mathematics suggests, then we've been surrounded by functional quantum technology for centuries without recognizing it. Technology created by artists and craftspeople who understood something about reality that we're only now beginning to measure." She pauses, and in that moment, something appears in the reflection on her monitor screen behind her. It's visible for perhaps 3 seconds before the camera angle shifts slightly. The reflection shows the laboratory behind her, the darkened testing chambers, the equipment racks, and something else. A distortion in the space near one of the chambers. Not a shadow, not a trick of light. The geometry itself appears wrong, as if the corner of the room has too many angles, as if space is folding in a way that three-dimensional reality shouldn't allow. And within that distortion, barely visible, what might be a pattern. Geometric. Repeating. Moving. One. Hassan doesn't seem to notice. She's looking directly at the camera. If something goes wrong tomorrow, she says, if the scaling effects are stronger than predicted, the data will survive. Everything uploads automatically. Someone will understand eventually. Someone will see what I'm seeing. The video ends. At 4:37 a.m. on March 14th, automated fire suppression systems activated in Hassan's laboratory. By the time emergency services arrived, the entire research wing was engulfed in flames described by the fire marshal as unusually intense and resistant to standard suppression methods. The official report cited catastrophic electrical failure, possibly related to Hassan's extensive experimental equipment. They never found her body. They never found the carpets either, though 4 reinforced testing chambers were discovered in the ruins, their doors sealed from the inside, their contents reduced to ash that chemical analysis couldn't definitively identify. But they did find one thing. A single camera, magnetically shielded in a fireproof housing that Hassan had installed without official approval. The memory card survived. The footage shows the interior of the main laboratory from a high corner angle, time-stamped beginning at 3:51 a.m. on March 14th. Hassan is visible, moving between the 4 testing chambers, making final adjustments. At 3:59, she enters the central control station and begins the activation sequence. On the monitors visible in the footage, wave patterns begin synchronizing across all 4 chambers. At 4:02, the first visible distortion appears. The space around one of the chambers seems to ripple like heat haze, but the pattern is geometric, echoing the carpet designs themselves. Hassan steps closer, holding some kind of handheld instrument toward the distortion. At 4:04, all 4 chambers show similar distortions simultaneously. The geometry of the laboratory space appears to be shifting, walls seeming to bend inward at impossible angles while remaining visually straight. Hassan is backing away now, toward the camera's field of view. But her eyes are fixed on something the angle doesn't fully capture. At 4:06, the footage shows what investigators later described as visual artifacts of unknown origin. The distortions around the chambers are growing, expanding outward, and within them, patterns are forming. Geometric configurations that seem to exist in more than 3 dimensions, that hurt to look at even in recorded footage. Several investigators reported nausea and disorientation after viewing this section of the video. At 4:07, Hassan reaches toward the emergency shutdown controls. But before she touches them, she stops, freezes completely, staring at something beyond the camera's view. The audio captures her voice, barely a whisper, but the automatic gain picks it up. Oh God! They knew. They knew exactly what they were making. At 4:08, the distortions encompass approximately 70% of the visible laboratory space. The testing chamber doors, clearly visible earlier, now appear to show darkness inside, but a darkness with depth, with pattern, with movement. At 4:09, Layla Hassan walks toward the nearest chamber. Not frantically, not as if fleeing. She walks deliberately, carefully, like someone approaching something sacred or terrible, or both. At 4:10, she steps into the distortion surrounding the chamber and disappears. Not into the chamber itself, into the geometric impossibility of the space around it. At 4:11, the electrical systems fail. The last frame shows the laboratory filled with pattern and light and angles that shouldn't exist, and then nothing. The footage ends. No official explanation was ever provided for what the camera recorded. MIT classified the investigation results. Hassan's research data, supposedly uploaded to her secure backup, was never released publicly. Her colleagues were bound by non-disclosure agreements as part of the incident settlement. But sometimes, in certain academic circles, people still whisper about the physicist who claimed ancient weavers created quantum machines by accident. They talk about the carpets that shouldn't have worked but did. And they wonder about that final footage, about where Dr. Layla Hassan walked when she stepped into impossible geometry and vanished from our understanding of reality entirely. The fire marshal's report sits in NIC's archives. Electrical failure. Accidental. Case closed. But attached to the file, visible only to those with appropriate clearance, is a single photograph taken of the laboratory ruins 3 days after the fire. In the ash and debris, burned into the concrete floor where the testing chambers once stood, are marks, patterns, geometric configurations that match, precisely, the designs of 16th century Persian carpets from workshops in Kashan. No one has explained how fire could burn patterns into concrete. No one has explained them at all. The darkness over Azerbaijan in the summer of 2019 carried with it something that would challenge every rational explanation, something that would force multiple governments to seal away evidence and silence witnesses. What began as isolated reports from rural villages quickly evolved into one of the most disturbing and well-documented cases in modern history. A case that drew uncomfortably close connections to the ancient manuscripts that scholars had dismissed as mere fantasy. It started in early June, in a small village called Kazakhs, near the Georgian border. Rashid Mammadov, a 53-year-old farmer, had stepped outside his home around 11:30 at night to check on his livestock when movement in the sky caught his attention. What he saw froze him in place. Silhouetted against the stars was a figure, unmistakably human in shape, seated upon what appeared to be an ornate carpet. The object moved silently through the night sky, perhaps 50 meters above the ground, traveling at a speed he estimated to be similar to a car driving through the village. But there was no sound, no engine noise, no whisper of wind. Just absolute silence as this impossible thing drifted overhead. Mammadov watched for nearly 2 minutes as the figure passed directly over his property. He could make out remarkable detail despite the darkness. The carpet itself seemed to possess an intricate pattern, even in the dim light appearing elaborate and ancient in design. The figure sitting upon it wore robes or garments that seemed completely out of place in the modern world, flowing fabric that looked heavy and ceremonial. What disturbed Mammadov most, what would keep him awake for weeks afterward, was the figure's posture and demeanor. The person, and he insisted it was indeed a person, sat perfectly still, gazing straight ahead as if traveling a familiar route. There was no acknowledgement of the world below, no indication that this being cared about, or even noticed being observed. Within days, more reports surfaced from villages along a direct line extending southeast from Kazakhs to Akstat. In the village of Agstafa, 28 kilometers away, 3 separate witnesses reported seeing the exact same phenomenon on the night of June 7. A shopkeeper named Layla Husainova had been closing her store when she heard her neighbor shouting. Both watched as the figure on the carpet passed overhead, following what appeared to be a deliberate path. Husainova later told investigators that the clothing looked medieval, perhaps even older, with what seemed to be elaborate embroidery or decoration visible even from the ground. The third sighting came from the village of Gazakh on June 9th, and this is where the documentation became impossible to dismiss. The village had recently installed security cameras in the central square as part of a local safety initiative. At approximately 11:47 that evening, the cameras captured something extraordinary. The footage, which would later be analyzed by experts from 3 different countries, showed a dark shape moving across the frame at a consistent altitude and speed. The object was clearly carpet-shaped, rectangular with what appeared to be tasseled or fringed edges. Upon it sat a figure in a rigid, upright position. The video quality was grainy due to the low light conditions, but enhancement would later reveal details that matched witness descriptions perfectly. What made this evidence truly compelling was that 2 other villages had also captured similar footage on the same night. Tovuz, 40 kilometers to the south, and Shamkir, another 30 kilometers beyond that, both had security systems that recorded the anomaly passing through their airspace. The timestamps synchronized perfectly with the speed and direction of travel. Investigators could trace a clear flight path, a deliberate route that the figure seemed to follow with purpose. By mid-June, local police had become involved, primarily because the volume of reports made ignoring the phenomenon impossible. Senior Detective Elvin Aliyev was assigned to lead the investigation, approaching it initially with deep skepticism. He expected to find evidence of drones, perhaps an elaborate hoax, or simply mass hysteria fueled by social media. What he found instead would transform him from skeptic to someone who understood that certain questions have answers we are not prepared to accept. Aliyev's team began by interviewing witnesses systematically. What emerged was a disturbing consistency in their accounts. 17 different witnesses across 6 villages all described the same details without prior communication or coordination. The carpet was dark, possibly deep blue or black, with ornate patterns and lighter colors. The figure wore robes or garments with long sleeves, and what several witnesses described as a head covering or turban. Most chilling was the universal observation about the figure's demeanor. Every witness used similar language. The figure seemed ancient, seemed focused on some distant destination, seemed completely unconcerned with the modern world below. During interviews, investigators also discovered something unexpected. Multiple witnesses reported feeling uneasy or experiencing a sense of profound wrongness during the sightings. Several described mild headaches that began when the figure appeared and faded after it passed. 2 witnesses mentioned a faint ringing in their ears. These physiological effects seemed minor, but added another layer of strangeness to an already inexplicable situation. The investigation took a crucial turn when Aliyev decided to examine the rooftops along the documented flight path. In Gazakh, on the roof of a building directly beneath where the security footage showed the figure passing, his team discovered unusual residue. It appeared as a fine dark powder with a slightly oily consistency, scattered in a pattern roughly 2 meters wide. Similar residue was found on rooftops in 3 other villages, always in locations that aligned with the projected flight path. Samples were sent to a laboratory in Baku for analysis. The results were disturbing in their implications. The residue contained a mixture of materials, fine silk fibers that carbon dating suggested were between 800 and 1,000 years old, traces of plant-based oils consistent with ancient preservation techniques, and most remarkably, mineral compounds that matched descriptions found in medieval Islamic manuscripts about carpet weaving. The specific combination of materials had no business existing together in the modern world, and certainly no explanation for being deposited on rooftops in rural Azerbaijan. Audio analysis provided another piece of the puzzle. A resident of Tovuz, who happened to be recording audio for a personal project, had his equipment running during one of the sightings. Buried in the recording, at a frequency just below normal human hearing range, was a consistent tone that appeared for exactly the duration the figure was visible overhead. Sound engineers who analyzed the file described it as a low-frequency hum, around 17 Hz, with strange harmonic properties. Several engineers who worked with the file for extended periods reported feeling anxious or unsettled, though this could have been psychological suggestion rather than a direct effect. By early July, the investigation had attracted attention far beyond local law enforcement. The Ministry of Internal Affairs in Baku had taken interest, and representatives from the Ministry of Defense arrived to review the evidence. International interest was growing as well, with Turkish and Russian agencies making quiet inquiries. The security footage had leaked online, accumulating millions of views and spawning countless theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Then came the night of July 15th, the final documented sighting, the event that would cause everything to be locked away behind layers of classification and government secrecy. In the village of Yevlak, word had spread about the previous sightings. Approximately 20 villagers had organized an informal watch group, hoping to witness the phenomenon themselves. Around midnight, their patience was rewarded. The figure appeared from the northwest, following the same general trajectory as before. But this time, the witnesses were prepared and determined to make contact. Several had powerful flashlights, and as the figure approached, they began signaling, waving lights and shouting upward. What happened next was captured on multiple cell phone cameras, and would become the most disturbing footage of the entire series of events. The figure, which had always maintained its steady, indifferent course, suddenly stopped. The carpet halted in midair perhaps 40 meters above the village square. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing moved. Witnesses would later describe an overwhelming sense of being watched, of attention being focused upon them in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. The figure slowly turned its head, looking down at the gathered crowd. Even in the darkness, multiple witnesses reported seeing what they described as eyes, impossibly bright, reflecting the flashlight beams like an animal's eyes in headlights. Then the figure raised one arm, a slow, deliberate gesture, Several witnesses described the movement as ritualistic, as though the figure were performing some kind of sign or invocation. The quality of the darkness around the carpet seemed to deepen, to become thicker somehow. 3 witnesses reported that their electronic devices, phones and flashlights, stopped working simultaneously. Others described an intense feeling of cold despite the summer heat, and a smell like burning incense mixed with something else, something old and musty like ancient fabric. The figure held this position for perhaps 10 seconds, then slowly lowered its arm. Without any acceleration, the carpet resumed its course, gliding away to the southeast at the same silent, steady pace as before. It disappeared over the hills, and none of the witnesses could bring themselves to follow. Several were crying. Others stood in shocked silence. One man had collapsed and needed medical attention for what doctors later described as an acute anxiety attack. The footage from that night circulated for less than 24 hours before being systematically removed from social media platforms. Witnesses who had posted videos found their accounts suspended. The next morning, government officials arrived in Yevlak with instructions that all material related to the sighting be surrendered. Detective Aliyev was called to Baku and informed that his investigation was being classified at the highest level. All physical evidence, including the rooftop residue samples, security footage, and audio recordings, was confiscated by the Ministry of Defense. Within a week, a coordinated information campaign began. Official statements described the sightings as misidentified drones operated by hobbyists, the security footage as doctored, and the witness accounts as the product of mass suggestion and social media influence. The government suggested that foreign actors might be behind the hoax, using it to create social instability. News organizations were discouraged from covering the story, and several journalists who persisted found themselves facing pressure from various official channels. But the classification extended beyond Azerbaijan. Intelligence services from Russia, Turkey, and Iran all took interest in the case. Diplomatic communications, later leaked to investigative journalists, revealed that all 4 governments had agreed to suppress information about the sightings. The reason given was preventing social panic and stopping the spread of destabilizing rumors. But analysts noted the unusual level of cooperation between nations that typically maintained competitive and sometimes adversarial relationships. What made multiple governments decide to bury this case? Some researchers point to the physical evidence, particularly the residue analysis. The presence of materials consistent with ancient artifacts suggested either an elaborate historical hoax involving genuine medieval materials, or something far more disturbing, that objects described in ancient texts might be real and still in use. Either possibility presented problems for official narratives about history, technology, and the nature of reality itself. Others suggest the response from the figure itself triggered the classification. The fact that it acknowledged the witnesses, that it stopped and appeared to react to their presence, transformed the case from unexplained phenomenon to potential contact scenario. If this was not a hoax, if something was actually flying over Azerbaijan on an ancient carpet, then its response to being signaled suggested intelligence, purpose, and perhaps even a warning. The witnesses from Yevlak, those who experienced that final encounter, were interviewed extensively by government officials and then asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. Most complied, traumatized by what they had seen and eager to move past the experience. A few refused and found themselves facing various forms of official harassment until they stopped speaking publicly about the events. Detective Aliyev, the lead investigator, retired early the following year. In a single, brief interview before ceasing all public comment, he stated that in his 30 years of police work, he had investigated murders, organized crime, and every form of human deception. Nothing in his experience prepared him for what he encountered in the summer of 2019. When asked directly if he believed the sightings were genuine, he paused for a long moment before answering that he believed the witnesses saw exactly what they described, and that sometimes the most rational conclusion is that we do not understand the world as well as we think we do. The figure on the carpet has not been reported since that final night in Yevlak, at least not in any reports that have reached the public. The light path it followed, when traced on a map, aligned with ancient trade routes that connected the Caucasus region with Persia and beyond. The villages where sightings occurred all existed during medieval times and were noted in historical records as waypoints for travelers. Whether this connection is meaningful or coincidental remains unknown, locked away with all the other evidence in classified archives that may never be opened. We return now to the silence that follows every investigation, that void where evidence accumulates but meaning refuses to crystallize. All the threads laid out before us, all the testimonies gathered across centuries and continents, and still the pattern remains just beyond comprehension. The carpets exist. This much cannot be disputed. They rest in climate-controlled vaults and forgotten storage rooms, cataloged as anomalies that institutions would rather not discuss. The descriptions remain unnervingly consistent across vast distances and disparate cultures. Witnesses separated by 800 years and 5,000 miles describe the same shimmer in the weaving, the same geometric patterns that seem to move when observed peripherally, the same sensation of falling upward. No cross-contamination of folklore could account for such precision in detail. The physical evidence defies what we understand about materials and age. Fibers that should have degraded centuries ago remain supple. Dyes that conventional analysis cannot identify. Weight distributions that violate basic physics when measured on sensitive equipment, though none will publish these findings for fear of professional ridicule. And then there are those who vanished. The researchers who pressed too close to understanding, the collectors who became obsessed, the academics whose final notes spoke of breakthrough revelations never shared. Their absences form their own kind of testimony, a negative space that suggests consequences for pursuing certain knowledge too aggressively. What are we to make of these artifacts? Technology implies understanding, replication, purpose within a framework we recognize. Magic suggests forces beyond natural law, which simply relocates the mystery rather than solving it. Perhaps these carpets exist in that liminal space between categories, objects that operated under principles humanity once grasped but has since forgotten, knowledge that slipped away as we built different frameworks for understanding reality. The question of activation haunts every researcher who has touched this subject. Why do certain carpets respond while others remain inert? Is it the weaver's intention crystallized in thread? Environmental conditions we cannot measure. Or does it require something from the observer themselves, some quality of perception or belief that most modern minds have systematically trained away? And what of the figure recorded on grainy footage in Azerbaijan, moving across the night sky on something that cameras registered as textile? Where did it come from? More urgently, where is it going? That question expands into existential territory because if the carpets still function, if knowledge of their activation still exists somewhere in protected lineages or hidden manuscripts, then this is not history. This is present tense. This is ongoing. Somewhere in a basement in Tehran, a carpet lies rolled and forgotten, its patterns facing inward in the darkness. In a private collection in London, another hangs on a wall where sunlight never reaches, its owner unaware of what previous hands wove into the warp and weft. In monasteries and mosques, in estate sales and university archives, they wait with the patience of objects that have already survived longer than the civilizations that created them. The ancients didn't weave carpets to fly. They wove them to remember what flew before humanity forgot how to see. That whisper reaches across centuries, suggesting that these artifacts are not aspirational but memorial, not imagining flight but preserving the memory of it. Before we narrowed our perception to the strictly material, before we agreed collectively on what was possible and what was not, perhaps the sky held more than we now allow it to contain. Perhaps these carpets are fossils of a different relationship with reality itself, one where consciousness and matter negotiated different terms. They remain patient and silent, waiting for eyes that remember how to truly look. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.